It didn't happen the way you might expect. There was no single document, no late-night revelation, no moment where everything clicked into place and I sat back in my chair with a chill running down my spine. It was quieter than that. It started with a photograph of children standing in front of a building that shouldn't have existed. The photograph was undated. It surfaced in a digitized archive from the St. Louis Public Library, their Missouri History Collection, Folder 7, Subsection, Municipal Orphanages, 1872-1889. The children were dressed in identical grey smocks. Behind them rose a building of extraordinary scale, with ornate carved facades and arched windows that began, apparently, below street level. I want to be careful here. I am not saying the building was buried. I am saying the windows began below what the children were standing on. That's a distinction worth holding on to. I noted it, bookmarked the image, and moved on. I told myself the photographer had stood on an elevated platform. I told myself it was probably nothing. I came back to it 3 weeks later. What brought me back wasn't drama, it was a word. In the catalogue description accompanying the photograph, someone, a librarian, an archivist, someone in 1953, had typed a single word in the notes field. The word was repopulation. Not residents, not wards, not orphans. The word was repopulation, and I am choosing that word deliberately because whoever typed it also chose it deliberately. I want to be honest with you. I do not know what that word means in context. It could be a bureaucratic term. It could be the archivist's personal shorthand. It could mean absolutely nothing. But it was enough to make me pull the thread, and when you pull a thread like that, sometimes the entire fabric begins to shift beneath your hands in ways you didn't anticipate and can't quite explain. I started with orphan population records. Specifically, I requested municipal census data from the St. Louis City Archive under a Missouri Sunshine Law. What came back? 847 scanned pages, processed over 11 weeks, contained something I wasn't expecting. The orphan population of St. Louis between 1870 and 1880 increased by 1,140%. Not 12%. 1,240%. At first, I told myself it was coincidence, or rather, I told myself it was context. The Civil War, disease, migration patterns. Those are real factors. Those explanations have merit, and I don't dismiss them, but the numbers didn't follow those patterns. Civil War orphan surges in the historical record appear in the late 1860s and taper off sharply by 1872. So I looked at Chicago. The Chicago Municipal Asylum records, housed at the Illinois Regional Archives Depository at Northeastern Illinois University, show a comparable surge between 1871 and 1882. The documented intake of children with unknown parentage increased by approximately 1,100%. The official explanation is the Great Chicago Fire of October 8, 1871. That's a real event, but fire records account for 297 confirmed deaths. The orphan intake over the following decade numbered in the thousands. I want to be careful here. I'm not saying fire records are wrong. I'm saying the math doesn't reconcile. When a catastrophe generates 4 verified adult deaths for every 1 child survivor listed as having no known family, the statistician in you starts asking questions the historian in you has trouble answering. Then I found Philadelphia. The Philadelphia Almshouse records, specifically the ledger books digitized by the Philadelphia City Archive in their 2019 Heritage Scan project, show intake documentation for foundling children beginning in earnest in 1873. The volume is staggering. Over 4,000 children processed in a 6-year window, with the notation origin unknown appearing with a regularity that begins to feel less like a data category and more like a policy. Someone was writing those words repeatedly. Someone had a stamp. At this point, I started looking at the buildings. This is where the conventional explanation started to feel untenable, and I want to walk you through it carefully, because the architecture matters more than almost anything else I found. The orphanages built between 1870 and 1890 in American cities were not modest structures, they were enormous. In some cases, they were the largest buildings in their respective cities at the time of construction, larger than city halls, larger than train stations. The St. Louis Protestant Orphan Asylum, located on Lawton Avenue, was documented in the 1876 Sanborn fire insurance maps as a structure spanning approximately 340 feet in total facade width. The Sanborn maps are not interpretive documents. They are technical survey drawings made for insurance risk assessment. They are about as boring and reliable as documents get, and this building, by those documents, was extraordinary, multi-winged, multi-storied, with a basement level that the map indicates extended a full story below grade on the western elevation. Below grade, I'm choosing that phrase deliberately. I filed a request with the St. Louis City Assessor's Office for original construction permits, foundation surveys, and demolition records for that structure. The building no longer exists. It was reportedly demolished in 1931. I wanted the paper trail. What I received after a 14-week processing delay was a single typed page stating that no construction permits prior to 1897 were held in the current archive system, and that pre-1897 records were subject to loss during municipal reorganization. I want to read that phrase back to you. Loss during municipal reorganization. Not fire, not flood, reorganization. The coincidence explanation was beginning to strain. I looked for demolition permits for the same building. There are none. There is no demolition permit in the St. Louis record for a 340-foot wide orphanage that stood on Lawton Avenue for at least 55 years. You don't demolish a structure that size without paperwork. You don't demolish it without labor contracts, waste hauling logs, utility disconnection filings. I requested all of those categories individually. In each case, utility records, labor filings, contractor bonds, the response was the same category of silence. Not denial, silence, absence. I want to be honest with you. Absence is not evidence of anything on its own. I know that. The absence of a record can mean the record was never created, was lost, was misfiled, or simply wasn't required under the regulations of the time. I accept all of that. But when absence appears consistently across multiple record categories, across multiple cities, across multiple decades, the absence itself becomes a pattern, and patterns require explanation. So I looked at the children again. There is a class of historical document called a foundling register. These are intake books maintained by orphan asylums, physical ledger books, usually handwritten, recording the name, estimated age, physical description, and origin of each child admitted. Dozens of these registers have been digitized and are available through university archive programs. I reviewed registers from St. Louis, Chicago, Philadelphia, Cincinnati, Detroit, and San Francisco, covering the years 1868 through 18. What I found in the origin column is difficult to describe without sounding like I am dramatizing. I am not dramatizing. In register after register, the listed origin for children admitted in the 1873 to 1882 window is not a neighborhood, not a county, not a street address. It is a phrase. The phrase varies slightly between institutions, but the core language is consistent, brought in from the surrounding country, or delivered from the outskirts, or in the Cincinnati Register for 1876, simply, from beyond. From beyond. I am not treating that phrase as supernatural. I want to be extremely clear about that. It is the language of a harried intake clerk writing quickly. But the geographic vagueness, the consistent, almost uniform lack of specificity about where these children came from, is an anomaly in a period when American bureaucracy was becoming increasingly detailed. Census records from the same decade ask for street addresses, birthplaces, parents' names, employers. Orphan intake records from the same decade say, from beyond. This raises a simple but critical question. Who was coordinating? Because what I'm describing is not one city, not one institution, not one bureaucratic failure. I'm describing a pattern across at least 6 major American cities. A synchronized surge in foundling children, with no documented origins, housed in buildings of extraordinary scale that appear to have been constructed without standard permits and demolished without standard records, all within a roughly 20-year window. Patterns at that scale don't emerge spontaneously. Patterns at that scale require infrastructure. I kept looking. I found the trains. Railroad expansion in the United States between 1865 and 1880 is well documented. But there is a specific program that doesn't receive commensurate attention in mainstream historical discussion: the orphan train movement, administered through the Children's Aid Society of New York, beginning formally in 1854 and running through 1929. The standard historical narrative frames this as a benevolent program to place city orphans with rural farming families, and it may have been exactly that. But the logistics, when examined carefully, suggest something more structured than benevolence. The Children's Aid Society processed, by its own records, approximately 250,000 children over the life of the program. 250,000. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. In a country whose total population in 1870 was approximately 38 million, that represents roughly one child redistributed for every 152 people in the nation. The program ran simultaneously with the foundling surges I had documented. The receiving end, rural families across the Midwest and West, left almost no paper trail of refusals, disputes, or origin inquiries. At first I told myself this was simply a product of the era, less documentation, less infrastructure, less accountability in rural settings. But then I found the same absence in Kansas, then in Nebraska, then in the township records of rural Ohio, where I requested intake and placement records from 12 counties and received across all 12 requests 0 documents predating 1891. The coincidence explanation buckled. I want to tell you about a specific document I found in 2023 through a FOIA-adjacent request to the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. The document is catalogued under Record Group 105, Records of the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen and Abandoned Lands, commonly called the Freedmen's Bureau. Within that record group there is a subfolder, Box 47, Folder 12, that contains a series of letters from 1869 and 8. The letters are from field agents reporting on populations in the American South. Several of these letters use terminology I had not encountered in the standard historiography of Reconstruction. The terminology is pre-existing children, as in, the region contains a significant population of pre-existing children whose origins are not accessible by standard inquiry. Pre-existing. I am choosing that phrase deliberately because the agent who wrote it chose it deliberately. Pre-existing to what? Pre-existing to what event? What census? What moment of administrative reckoning? The letters do not say. There is a gap in the folder. Pages 14 through 22 are listed in the index, but are physically absent, not redacted. Absent. I found the same terminology, pre-existing, in an 1871 report from a California State Commission on Indigent Populations, filed with the California State Archive in Sacramento. I found a variant, previously resident, in a Manitoba territorial report from 1873, now held by Library and Archives Canada. I want to be careful here. 3 instances of similar phrasing across different documents from different jurisdictions is not proof of coordination. It is, however, exactly what you would expect to find if a coordinated terminology had been issued and partially preserved in the record. This is where I started thinking about Tartaria. I want to address this carefully, because the word Tartaria carries enormous baggage in online spaces. It has been annexed by a culture of motivated reasoning, by people who have decided the conclusion and worked backward through the evidence. I am not doing that, but the question of a large, organized, sophisticated civilization that may have occupied parts of Central Asia, Russia, and possibly the Americas prior to the mid-19th century is not a fringe question. It appears in mainstream encyclopedias, in the work of 18th century European cartographers, and in the Encyclopaedia Britannica of 1771, which describes Tartaria as a vast country in the northern parts of Asia, bounded by Siberia on the north and west. What happened to Tartaria? The standard answer is that it dissolved, absorbed into the Russian Empire through a series of military campaigns across the 18th century. That's the answer, and I held that answer for a long time because it is well-sourced and reasonable. But the cartographic record is strange. Maps from the early 18th century show Tartaria occupying territory that dwarfs modern Russia. By 1860, it has effectively vanished from European cartography. Not diminished, not renamed, vanished. The speed of that cartographic erasure within a roughly 80-year window is at minimum anomalous. I want to be honest with you. I don't know what Tartaria was. I want to be honest about the full extent of my uncertainty here. I don't know if it was a single political entity, a geographic designation, a confederation, or something the European mapmakers were projecting onto a landscape they didn't understand. I hold all of those possibilities simultaneously, but I also hold this. Whatever it was, it generated no refugee documentation, no diplomatic correspondence of dissolution, no treaties of absorption that I can locate in the standard record. Empires don't dissolve in silence. Empires leave paper, except when they don't. And then you have to ask what kind of event removes not just a civilization but its record, and whether the children filling orphan intake registers in St. Louis and Chicago and Philadelphia in the 1870s might have walked out of the end of something so large that the people inheriting the world afterward didn't have a category for what they were looking at. I am not stating that, I want to be clear. I am asking whether the question is worth holding. I went back to the architecture. Specifically, I went back to the question of what the buildings below street level actually mean. The mud flood theory, and I use the word theory loosely, in the colloquial sense, not the scientific sense, posits that a large-scale geological or catastrophic event in the mid-19th century deposited significant sediment across urban areas, burying the lower floors of existing structures and creating the appearance of buildings that seem to begin underground. I want to be careful here, because this theory is almost entirely circulated in non-academic spaces, and has significant evidential problems. But the buildings are real. The windows below grade are real. The Sanborn maps document them. The 1868 Philadelphia City Survey, a formal municipal document held at the Philadelphia City Archive, notes, in routine language, that several structures on Market Street exhibit foundation exposure inconsistent with standard construction practice, suggesting prior sediment coverage. That's not a conspiracy theorist writing. That is a city surveyor, in 1868, noting that the ground around certain buildings appeared to have risen. This is where the conventional explanation started to feel untenable. Because here is what the conventional explanation requires you to accept simultaneously: that orphan populations in multiple American cities surged by over 1,000% in a synchronized window with no common documented cause, that the buildings built to house them were of extraordinary, almost inexplicable scale with no surviving construction records, that a major Eurasian civilization vanished from cartography within a century with no diplomatic record of dissolution, that city surveyors in 1868 were noting sediment anomalies around existing structures, and that the children in those buildings were listed repeatedly as coming from beyond. The coincidence explanation broke. I don't know what I'm looking at. I want to be absolutely honest with you about that. I have spent 2 years and 4 months accumulating these anomalies, and I cannot draw a clean line through them. I cannot tell you that Tartaria ended in a cataclysm that deposited sediment across 2 continents and left hundreds of thousands of children with no parents and no names walking out of the wilderness into American cities in the 1870s. I cannot tell you that. The evidence does not allow that level of certainty, and I am not willing to exceed the evidence. But I can tell you what the evidence does allow. It allows the question. It more than allows the question. It insists on the question. There is a photograph in the Missouri History Collection, Folder 7, subsection Municipal Orphanages. In the photograph, children in grey smocks stand in front of a building with windows that begin below their feet. One child, in the front row, is looking not at the camera but slightly to the side, at something outside the frame. Her expression is not distress. It is not grief. It is something harder to name. The expression of someone who remembers something that the world around her has already stopped remembering. I keep going back to that face. I keep going back to the word repopulation. Who typed that word? Who chose it over residents, over orphans, over wards? Someone sat at a typewriter in 1953 and chose the word that means filling a place with people again, which implies the place was empty first, which implies something happened to the people who were there before, which implies a before. What was the before? I don't know. I want to be honest with you. I genuinely, completely do not know. I know that cities in the 1870s were full of children without names, and buildings without permits, and surveyors noting sediment where sediment should not have been. I know that a civilization the size of a continent stopped appearing on maps without a war that explains it, and without a treaty that records its end. I know that 250,000 children rode trains into rural territories whose intake records have not survived. What do you do with all of that? What do you do when the absence in the archive is louder than anything the archive contains? What do you do when the silence is too consistent to be accidental, and too broad to be a single cover-up, and too deep to be explained by bureaucratic inefficiency alone? What do you do when a child in a grey smock is looking at something outside the frame, and you realise the frame is the problem, that everything we've been taught to look at was selected for us by people who had a reason to point the camera in a particular direction? I'm still looking. I'm still pulling records, still filing requests, still sitting with digitised ledger books at 2 in the morning, reading the same phrase, origin unknown, origin unknown, origin unknown, until the words stop looking like words and start looking like a door that someone sealed from the other side. I went back to the photograph again last week. The building behind the children, with its windows below the earth, the child looking sideways at something I cannot see. I don't know what she's looking at. I don't know where she came from. I don't know what ended so that she could be standing there in that grey smock, in front of that impossible building, in a city that was filling itself with children the way you fill a vessel, carefully, deliberately, as though something had just been emptied. I don't know, and the not knowing has a shape now. It has a weight. It sits at the edge of everything. I think I understand about the 19th century, and it asks, very quietly, whether the world I was taught to recognize was built on top of something else, something older, something larger, something that left its children behind when it went.